Yes, sir.
Okay, so
Yes, sir.
right, so for recording purposes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be looking at the respiratory system. And as one of your colleagues just mentioned, and as Shaloma has pointed out on the chat, of course, yes, it is important. Without it, well, what would happen if we didn't have a respiratory system?
So we won't be able to breathe or function.
Right. And why do we need to breathe? Do we need to breathe at all? What's the major role behind breathing? We breathe in air to do what? What do we do with that air we breathe in? Oh, let's start again. What's the major component? The major composition of air is mainly nitrogen, right? But we don't use nitrogen, we use oxygen. And what do we use that oxygen for?
So to push around the body,
To stay alive, yeah, to push around the body, right?
to
But
help pump blood.
right, it goes into the blood, and then that is used to break down food. So if you were to think about it in terms of respiration, when we take it in at the level of the lung, that lung, we also have, which is known as external respiration. Then we have the oxygen diffuses into the blood, and then it goes and eventually it diffuses into the cells, the body's cells, which is known as tissue respiration, gets in. And when it gets in there, what it does is that glucose is also present, or sugars, nutrients are carried in the blood. So that gets into the cell as well. That oxygen plus food, which is glucose, simplest form of food, is then broken down into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Energy in the form of three letters. What are the three letters for energy in the body? It's a universal system, very much like a links
ATP?
card. ATP.
Oh my.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead. You wanted to ask a question? Go ahead. Or you were going to
So
say ATP?
ATP,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
ATP.
ATP.
Yes, correct. So ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is a universal currency. That is the only type of energy. So when you're looking, if you want to open your nose hole muscle and them, it uses ATP. If you want to move your little toe muscles uses ATP. It's a universal currency. And one of the good things about having just one currency of energy is that it's very efficient. Think about it. Imagine if you're going to buy something to eat and it had, let's say KFC money, and then it have Royal Castle money, and then it have Pizza Hut money. It have all different types. Your wallet will be large and be very, if it is you do go out, it'll be very complicated. If you suddenly say, you know what? Okay, let me go and get some Pizza Hut. You had to check, oh shoot, I leave my Pizza Hut money home. I had to go back home. And whereas if you just have a links card, which is accepted in all Pizza Hut, KFC, and Royal Castle, it's very simple. Similarly, in the body, that energy that we produce is accepted universally in any cell or any part of the body, any tissue, to bring about motion, usually as a result of muscle contraction. So that's one of the great things with the body as it relates to that. But the main reason we take in oxygen is to break down the food. Oxygen plus food gives you carbon dioxide, water, and of course, that energy. And that energy now is most of the times often used for muscle contraction. We good? Which is why when you stop breathing, you'll speak with the ancestors, because energy production just stops and you enter a vicious circle where that is concerned. Let's look at that respiratory system. The location of the respiratory system as shown in this diagram, it's in the thorax or the chest area. And the components, it starts from here, the nose, your nasal cavity, your pharynx, which is broken up into your nasal, oral, and laryngeal pharynx. Laryngeal just superior to the larynx or the voice box. Your nasopharynx posterior to the nasal cavity, and the oropharynx posterior to the oral cavity. From there passes your trachea, and your trachea has cartilage. So this white covering of the trachea or the tube is cartilaginous. It has cartilage. And what is the importance of having cartilage over your trachea? It serves a purpose. Imagine this is something that is stiff. Why would we want to have something stiff? Over this is a relatively flexible and soft tube. Why would we want to have something stiff over it? to prevent something from happening to this tube, a word that beginning with C. 8 letters and it rhymes with collapse.
Collapse.
Right. So we don't want, very good, we don't want the trachea to collapse. What would happen if the trachea collapses in terms of bringing air into the lungs? Would the amount of air coming into the lungs increase or decrease if this tube gets flattened out?
Decrease.
Decrease, yeah, very good. Yeah, it would decrease because it's just like a tube. Think about, a hose and you're spraying water. If you squeeze on the hose, less water coming through, and ultimately, the jet of water coming out at the end of the hose goes down. So similarly, if you're looking at air that is coming in, if this were to collapse, yeah, you wouldn't get air going down to your lungs, or at least less air would get in. So that's why you have cartilage, around it. And it's cartilage protects the tube and ensures it remains open all the time. Very important fact. So the air comes down, the trachea bifurcates, a big word meaning splits into two. It splits into two and forms the bronchi. The bronchi get smaller, bronchioles. And then at the end of the bronchiole or the terminal bronchiole, you have these little things which are known as bunches of grapes. We'll see it in a second, but it looks like a bunch of grape or a bunch of chenet or a bunch of piwa. Right? These little circular items, and they're known as alveoli. And very important to note, the only place where absorption of oxygen occurs into the bloodstream is at the alveoli. We'll look at the details of that in a little bit, but do appreciate that. So whereas the respiratory tract starts from the nose, it comes all the way down into the lungs itself, the only place where the absorption into the blood occurs is at the terminal end of the bronchioles, at the areas known as the alveoli. And we'll speak a little more detail in just a second. So here it is. Let's look at it structurally in terms of the thorax. You have the ribs. So your ribs, this is your larynx or your voice box. Your trachea, it comes down. And then of course you have the rib cage, which protects the lungs. And usually in your body, you would find that organs which are quote unquote important, they are protected by areas of the skeletal system. Could you think of another organ in your body that is protected, by bone or skeletal, skeletal material? Can you think of another organ? Part of the nervous system, a very important, well, actually two parts of your central nervous system that is covered by bone.
Your brain.
Excellent, excellent. Your brain is one. And another one which is very important for movement. And if this is severed or cut in any way, usually you get paralyzed.
Your spine.
Right, your spinal cord. Very, very good. Right? So if you'll notice your spinal cord is encased in vertebrae. And with your brain itself, your brain is actually covered or housed within the cranium or skull. So very important fact to note about your body. Important things usually have bone around them. So this is just showing the lung. This is a preserved specimen showing both your right and left lung. Now, in terms of respiration, we mentioned these terms again, but let's just have a little closer look. Pulmonary, movement of air into and out of the lungs. External gaseous exchange, absorption of oxygen, right? Just referring to the absorption of oxygen from the lung into the blood and the removal of CO2 from the blood into the lungs. Right, and then you have internal, the transfer of oxygen from the blood to the cells and the transfer of CO2 from the cells to the blood. All right, so internal and external. External is from the external environment. Internal is from the blood into the cell itself. So the respiratory system could be divided really into two parts, the upper and lower respiratory systems. And they consist of head, nose, nasal cavity, runs from the head up to the pharynx, and the lowest part of the pharynx is just superior to the larynx, right? The oropharynx. and the lower respiratory system, which begins at the larynx and goes down to the lungs. Let's see how we can have a look at that. So the upper part from the nose all the way down right here to the larynx, the superior portion of the larynx. And then you have the lower respiratory tract beginning at the larynx and going all the way down to the lung. We'll notice this muscle here, the diaphragm. When we're speaking of respiration, the diaphragm is probably the most important muscle. There's some other muscles as well, the intercostal muscles, which run between the ribs, and they move the ribs up and down. And there's also a bone that goes from the hyoid bone, which is located here, and it comes down to the lung, and it also goes across. It is known as the sternocleidomastoid muscle, right? So that one, so when you're thinking about respiration, three major muscles should come into play, or what you should think about: sternocleidomastoid, the intercostals, and the diaphragm, right? But the major ones, of course, are these two, the intercostal muscles and this diaphragm. Note that in the resting position, the diaphragm has a shape like, what shape you'd call this? What shape you'd call this? Anybody, what you'd call this shape? Okay, well, they call it a dome shape. Usually, that is one of the things. A dome, all right, thanks, Shaloma. Yeah, a dome shape, so it looks like a upside down cup or something like that. So that's it in its resting position. When it contracts, it flattens out and it pushes down. So I like to call the diaphragm the guts pusher down muscle, because when it does contract, it moves down and literally it pushes your guts down, right? The large intestines and the small and large intestine pushes them down, and it creates space for the expansion of the lungs. So do remember, the diaphragm is your guts pusher down muscle. Please don't write that on any standardized exam. When they say what muscle is this and you write guts pusher down, no. But if you write it for me in one of my assessments, yeah, I would give you it correct because I know where you're coming from. But in standardized exam, please don't write guts pusher down. I just mentioned that so you could be able to visualize its action, what exactly it does. So some of the zones associated, the conductance zone, this is the area that carries air into the lungs and it doesn't participate in gaseous exchange itself, right? This is lined almost entirely by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And if you were to go back to SnF1, the pseudostratified ciliated, these are columnar, they're longer, they're taller rather than they're wide, and they have cilia which beat and they remove things out of the lungs in the event that something gets down into your lungs. Is it a problem if something gets into your lungs? Is that a problem?
Yeah.
Why is it a problem if something gets down into your lungs? Why is that a problem? What could happen if something, let's talk about if food gets down into your lungs, what could happen? What could possibly happen? A word that begins with I. You could choke, that is true, if it's big enough. And when you start to choke, we'll talk about the word that begins with I just now. But let's say if a bolus of food or a large piece of food gets down into your lung, and
So you could suffocate?
You could suffocate, that's right. So does your body have a reflex action when something goes down into your lungs? There is a reflex action. What happens?
Yes, so you just cough.
Yeah.
You begin to cough. Indeed, you begin to cough. So that is very, very good. And the reason why is because clearly it is not a situation you want to be in. Let's get back to the food. If food gets down into your lungs and is not removed, what do you think will happen? What will happen to that food? What do you think will happen? Anybody? If food gets down into your lungs, what, and it stays there.
It could poison you. I don't know.
It could poison you. Yes. It could poison you. Quite right. Right. So that could one of the things that got me could poison you. And the reason how it poisons you as well is because bacteria. Now, one of the things you have to remember in terms of your immune system, go ahead. Somebody wanted to say something. Go ahead.
So I was going to say it could damage like the tissues in your lungs.
It surely could if it stays there, yeah. And the reason how it damages it, because it could promote bacteria, microorganisms to flourish. One of these things in terms of organisms, infection, thank you, Tiola. Yeah, infection was what I was looking for. Once food is available, it's a sign for microorganisms to replicate once they see food. And we have to remember the main reason why we are here as biological beings is to do what? What is the main reason why we are here on Earth? It's just to do one thing and one thing only. And that is to eat. Well, that is part of it, yes. Something that begins with R.
To reproduce.
That's it. Yeah. What would happen if we didn't reproduce? We would go what? We'll be wiped out. Or we would become extinct. Yeah, very good. Right. Thanks, Shaloma. Yeah, we become extinct. So that's right. The major thing, of course, you can look at it any nice way, but the major reason biologically beings, and we're talking multicellular organisms like humans or unicellular organisms like a virus or a bacteria, the only reason they're really there is just to reproduce, is it? Because if we don't reproduce, you will disappear as a species or as a microorganism, as a bacteria, as a virus, or some other unicellular organism. So once food in particular is a reflex, somewhere written into the DNA or the RNA, as it might be in the case of certain viral species, written into there is this thing that, look, when you see food, replicate, reproduce. Because once you reproduce a whole lot of offspring, the chances of survival, does it increase or decrease? If you have a lot of offspring, the chances of them going on, of carrying on, the genetic, of carrying on those genes, does it increase or decrease? If you have a lot or if you just have a few? Which one is better?
It increases.
Yeah. I think back in the day as well, sometime when you're reading some of those stories, people when they had farms or what have you not, they'd have a whole lot of children. And that was when, let's say, disease was rampant. So, one of the reasons.
So what about the times our parents is alive where they was making like about 7 and 8 children or kind of thing?
Correct. And I know
when
about
they
that.
didn't have no TV.
Well, not necessarily no TV, because I come from a family of 7 and we used to have TV. But I understand what you mean. I just say that in jest. Yeah, there was a time when they would have lots of children, indeed. And the reason why, particularly around the time when disease was widespread, before the appreciation of antibiotics, right? So when you usually have some type of virus, like for instance, now we have vaccines when you're looking at COVID and kept the population up. Back in the day, when, let's say, if a viral infection hit, yeah, people both. So you have 5 children, well, 3 of them might be called home to talk with the ancestors, So what people used to do as well, you could speculate on other reasons why in terms of entertainment and so on, without the presence of TV and what have you not. But one of the reasons they would have lots of children was because of the fact they were, just in case, some disease comes, well, at least I'll have a couple, a few of them left. So if it's 11, all right, and at the end of the day, after a couple of years of disease, all right, I have 7, okay, fair enough, or I have 4, okay. So that was one of the reasons as well. So similarly, when you look at microorganisms, when they see food, yeah, it just switches on. It's something in there hard written into their RNA or DNA, depending on the type of organism. Let's replicate. replicate, and that's what they do. When they see food, they replicate. Let's relate that to the lung. If you're taking something and it remains in the lung, remember your immune system is always fighting these microorganisms off, bacteria and so on. So in the lung itself, there are, right now, if you were to take a lung scrape and look, you would see that there are microorganisms there. But the thing is, when you have food, they will replicate. So now, even though they're being kept under control by the immune system in terms of their numbers, right, the macrophages with their phagocytotic activity, you know, they engulf them and destroy them. But when it has food, they replicate very quickly. And if left unchecked, if the immune system is overwhelmed, it could lead to infections. And as quite rightly, as somebody pointed out, when these things replicate and they're eating food, they give off waste product, and the waste product sometimes could be toxic to the body itself. So that's why it's very important to get food out of your lungs, or anything for that matter, which could cause, some of these things could cause physical damage to your lung. And we looked just now at pneumothorax. Pneumothorax is, let's say, well, you wouldn't get it. It's a piercing of the lung. Usually you get that, let's say, from a stab wound. All right. And what usually happens in the case of a pneumothorax, because of the fact the lung is sealed, when it is, you do get a stab wound or a puncture wound to the lung, what they have to do is actually blow air into the space between the lung and the ribs to actually literally reinflate your lung. And then they suture up, if necessary, the wound entrance. And usually within the space of about 3 to 4 weeks, the wound will heal in terms of forming a scar there, and you're good to go. Right, so that's how they usually treat stab wounds. They remove the air, that air pocket that develops, because literally your lung is in a sealed area. So if it's punctured, it shrivels up. So they have to remove the air, and in removing the air, that negative pressure opens back out the lung. We'll speak to that in just a little bit as well. Lungs, food goes down, has to come out. So we have this cough reflex built in. So you cough out the food and you get rid of it, because if it stays in the lung, it could lead to infection. And that is not a condition you'd want to stay in. Not only do you have the cough reflex, mucus is produced as a result of infection as well, because mucus, what you're trying to do is trap particles and then move them out of the lung. If you have excessive mucus buildup, that in and of itself could also lead to another issue. All right, so we spoke to the conductance zone, and this conductance zone is from the nose to the nasal cavity, the nasopharynx, oro, laryngo, larynx, trachea, into your bloodstream, into the mainstream bronchi, the lobar bronchi, the segmental, and then into the bronchioles. The bronchioles are the subdivisions of the bronchus, and they're just in front of the alveoli. So there, here it is. Here you're looking at the...
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
You could just let me in the meeting on my custard account because my phone going to die.
Sorry, one more time?
Can you let me in the meeting on my custard account? My phone is going to die.
Sorry, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of gaseous exchange, right, the gaseous exchange occurs, air pathway from the ducts to the sacs, right? And then you have these two types of pneumocytes, the type 1 and the type 2. All right, let me just... Okay, all right, just give me one second here. Okay. All right, so let's continue in terms of the gaseous exchange. So I just wanted to get this in terms of the pathway going from the alveolar ducts into the pulmonary capillaries. So this is as showing, if you were to just take one step back, the pathway going down to the bronchioles. After it gets...
Excuse me, sir, we aren't seeing anything.
You got me frightened there, boy. You have a kind of ascorbic voice. You shake me up there, I nearly dropped my microphone. You can see it now?
Yes, sir.
Right, yes. Okay, good. Yeah. All right. So we're looking at the respiratory zone in terms of the exchange of gases. So oxygen comes in, and then carbon dioxide is given off, as is expected in terms of normal respiratory exchange. So within these alveoli, you have what are known as pneumocytes, and these line the alveoli within the lung itself. There are two types of these pneumocytes. You have type 1. The type 1 pneumocytes, these are thin and flattened, and these are responsible for the gaseous exchange between the alveoli and capillaries. So these are the type 1 pneumocytes. The type 2 pneumocytes are shown here. These are smaller and they are cuboidal in shape. These are more responsible for the secretion of pulmonary surfactant in order to reduce the surface tension in the alveoli. It's always important to remember in terms of absorption of gases, gases are more readily absorbed from a moist surface. All right, anybody here have any family or anything, or maybe themselves asthmatic, or have persons who suffer with, yeah? One of the things, they use a nebulizer.
Yes,
And in terms of the nebulizer, you'd always notice in the gas, oxygen, they don't feed the oxygen directly into, or it's not directly delivered to the person. But instead, what happens is bubbled through a liquid, yeah?
sir.
And the reason why they do it is because it moistens the oxygen, and in so doing, it is more readily absorbed across the lung surface. That's always important. Not only that, it also makes it easier to actually put in medications into that little vessel containing water. It's very easy to add it there. But notwithstanding that, the moist air is more readily absorbed as opposed to dry air, which is why if somebody even does get an asthma attack, where do you think it'll be better to put them? Close to a stove or inside an air-conditioned room? Which one do you think the air will be more readily absorbed?
So by the stove?
In terms of, so why would you say by the stove? Because, yeah.
The heat.
Or the heat. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But looking at it from the perspective of moisture, where would you get more moisture? In an air-conditioned room or close to a stove? Yeah, so the air-conditioned room. So I don't know if persons who might have, persons who are asthmatic and so on, sometimes you might hear that, put them in an air-conditioned room, yes, because of the fact in an air-conditioned room, the air itself is not dry, but it's carrying moisture, so it's more readily absorbed in the lung itself.
Excuse, or even steam from the shower.
Yes, that's another good one. Yeah, just let run hot water in a shower and let them breathe in the steam, because that air is moist. Very good. Yeah, that's a very good
So my
example.
That's why a lot of asthmatics have the
nebulizer.
Yes.
Yeah, correct.
Not the nebulizer, the oh gosh, the one you just put the water in and the steam out.
Vapor, humidifier.
Humidifier.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
I have a humidifier at home, and it helps a lot.
Yeah, correct is right. Because of the fact, when it's moist, is a lot more, is readily taken up. So that's a very good example there, in terms of a steam shower or a humidifier.
So that's just like if you're putting like peppermint oil in the hot water.
Correct. Well, peppermint oil in and of itself, that has some therapeutic effect as well. But even breathing in back to the hot water as well, that's another way. If you heat hot, let's say heat water, and let's say you put the oil in and you cover your head with a towel, yeah? And you put your head over it. Yeah, that's a nice way in terms of getting, the oxygen into your lungs. But the most important thing is that moisture. So if you take the peppermint oil and you just throw it in water, you don't really smell it as well. The other reason, because the the oil itself is volatile, so you smell it better when it's heated, right? But the peppermint oil does have some therapeutic effects, which I'm not too clear of, so I wouldn't speculate on them, but it does have therapeutic effects in terms of the peppermint oil. But those are some examples of how you could get moisture into the air that you breathe in. One, we mentioned the air condition. Two, we mentioned by a shower, just turning on a hot shower. Three, by actually heating water and putting a towel over your head. And four, using a nebulizer or a humidifier. So those are ways, you know, that you could actually get moist air into your lungs. Yeah, very good. All right, so type 1, in terms of the pneumocytes, the type 1s are the flattened ones, and these facilitate the gaseous exchange between the alveoli and the capillaries. What is very special about capillaries? So here, if we look here, this is the alveolar air. This is inside the alveolus. So this is like this section you're looking at, all right? And this is the blood flow in the capillaries. What is special about the capillaries that allows air to move into and out of the blood, but the capillary itself and into the alveolar airspace, and conversely from the airspace into the capillary? Well, there's something special about this lining. How thick is it? Is it A, 1 cell thick, B, 5 cell thick, or C, 100 cells thick? That allows
A?
Yes, A, very good answer. Yeah, it's 1 cell thick. So that's the unique things with capillaries. They're just 1 cell thick. And not only are they just 1 cell thick, they have spaces in between the cells. So those spaces allow very easy movement of air. And that is why capillaries which surround the alveoli, right, they allow the movement of air out of from in the airspace of the alveoli, move into the capillary. And this movement is brought about by a certain phenomena. Movement, so the air or the oxygen is moving from its area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And what is that process known as? Begins with D.
Diffusion.
Excellent.
Diffusion.
Yes. Yeah, very good. Very good. Right. Thanks very much. So diffusion. So the air is moving from its high to low. And then relatively in the bloodstream, carbon dioxide levels are high. So it moves from its area of high concentration to the area of low concentration, which is inside the alveolus, and it moves out. So that's why you have this gaseous exchange occurring. But most importantly, it's brought about because of the fact you have these alveoli, which are 1 cell thick. And of course, these cells which line them, these are the type 1 pneumocytes, and these are the cuboidal ones. These are smaller, and they're responsible for the secretion of surfactant. So these allow diffusion, but these secrete the surfactant, that liquid. And the reason, as we mentioned, the oxygen is able to dissolve in that layer and is more readily absorbed because of the fact it is absorbed into that surfactant or liquid that is actually on the lung itself. And that liquid is produced by the type 2 pneumocyte. And this is just showing you an example of the type 1 and the type 2. This is what they look like. If I were to ask you, this distance from here to here, how long is it? What would you say? Approximately how long? A, 20 micrometers, B, 100 micrometers, or C, 1 millimeter? This distance from here to here, what would you say? A, 20 micrometers. Okay, I'll change the numbers. A, 20 micrometers, B, 20 millimeters, or C, 20 meters. Which one would you say it is? Micro, millimeter, or meters long? And the answer is micrometer. And how do we know? We look right up here. Whenever you see images such as this showing cells, now the thing is we really don't know how big it is. So what you always look when you get these slide images, just look around. You'll see something that has like a line above it, and below the line, you'll see a number. So what this is telling you is that this distance from here to here is actually 20 micrometers in length. So that's how you get a feeling as to how big this is. Now, I already told you all how big a micrometer is, yes? I explained that one to you all already, yes? In terms of a micrometer. Maybe I haven't, let's revisit it. If you take your thumb, I spoke to it about it already, yeah?
No, sir.
Okay, well, let's revisit it. Oh, let's visit it for the first time. If you take your index finger and your thumb and you press them together, yeah? Everybody doing that? Squeeze it together, your thumb and your index finger. And just pull it apart until you could see light between your thumb and your index finger. You seeing that? A little space where you're now seeing light? That is one, that is 1 millimeter. That little distance then between your two fingers, when as soon as you start to see light, that's 1 millimeter. If you divide that space into 1,000, you'll get 1,000 micrometers. You'll get one micrometer. So 1,000 micrometers make up 1 millimeter. So when you think about it, so now imagine you take, so imagine you're dividing that little space into 1,000, and each one of those, so each 1/1000th of a millimeter, that's a micrometer. Now you take 20 of those. So there's a symbol for micro. It looks like a funny shape U. This is a micrometer. And now you take 20 of them, and that is 20 micrometers. So this is really, really small in terms of an alveolar cell. These things are really small. And it just points to the fact of how incredible your body is. And I like to say your body is a machine because it does all of this work. Here it is on the level inside of your lungs. We're looking at our alveolus. These are the alveolar cells, right? The type 1, which allow diffusion, and the type 2 that secrete the surfactant. And these things are so small and they do the job all the time. This is mind-blowing, right? And we don't even think about it, but they do their job efficiently and we are able to breathe in and breathe out. Absolutely fascinating. Let's go forward. So just for in terms of definitions and differences between type 1 and type 2, here you'll see them. And what I would do, because I updated the slide that is placed, that was on the that is currently on your lab site, I will update it because I put in some new images there, including this one, which shows the differences between type 1 and type 2. So I'll put this in once the lab is finished. All right, so we looked at that. Let's move on now to the upper respiratory. Previously, what we are looking at, this is the respiratory zone. Now we're looking at the upper respiratory. So this is from your nose all the way down to your nasal concha, so-called because the inner part of the nasal cavity, it actually is lined and looks like the inside of a shell. So that's why like a conch shell. So that's why they call it a concha. Okay. And then you have the pharynx, which begins at the nasopharynx, which is the area posterior to the nasal cavity. It goes to the oropharynx. The oropharynx is posterior to the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, which is superior to the larynx. All right, so you have your nose. Let's speak about these parts, the nose and the pharynx. So the nose is the organ of smell. What happens when you have a cold? Do you smell things the same way, or do they smell a little differently? And as it relates to taste as well, when you have a cold, do things taste the same or do they taste differently? All right, we have a response on the chat. Let me see.
No.
All right,
You don't even smell at all.
Pardon? You don't even smell at all. That's quite right.
Yeah, and you don't even have taste in your mouth.
And you don't have taste in your mouth. But just goes to show, when you're looking at the whole notion of taste, it's very intimately associated with smell. Smell and taste go together. And then when you're not smelling something, it affects the way how it tastes, right? So in particular, salt, you don't really taste salt or sweet. You know, it's just off. The food just tastes off, right? And that just shows us the importance of it. So your nose itself, it has different parts. You have the external nose, and then you have the internal nose, which consists of the cavity, the hard and soft palate, the nasal concha, and of course the sinuses, which are air-filled cavities. They're lined with mucus, and they also have cells associated with the immune system found in the sinuses. So this is just showing the area that we just mentioned. Here is the nose. Of course, it's cartilaginous, right? You have the septum between the nasal well, the nares or your nose holes, right? You have a septum there of cartilage. An interesting fact, here it is in section. This shows the so this is the nasal passages, and this here would be the cartilaginous separation. And for some persons, you know, they sometimes have a ring here, a nose ring, you know, they put it in there through that cavity. The pharynx now, the pharynx is the throat. This is part that is superior to the larynx, the pharynx itself. The nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, so-called because of their association close to the nasal region, oral region, and superior to the, or posterior to the, well, they're superior to your voice box, the larynx, right? So it's superior to the laryngopharyngeal region. This is showing it here. There's the nasal cavity, nasopharynx, more, you know, to the back of the nasal cavity, oro to the back of the oral cavity. There's the oral cavity here, and the laryngeo, right, which is superior to the larynx. Larynx or your voice box is usually there. What structure is this here? This big structure here. What's this one called? Begins with T. And you like to stick it out. When you're a little child, you push it out when somebody tell you something. That's a tongue. There's actually a tongue. I know it looks strange, yeah, because we're more associated with the top part, but as you can see, it's a big muscle. And what is this structure here? It begins with an E and is like the policeman of the throat. It allows things to go down either the esophagus, correct, the epiglottis, right? If the epiglottis isn't working, would that be a problem?
Yes, sir.
What the problem will be if your epiglottis isn't working? What could possibly
Especially
happen?
when food is going down your
Your esophagus, yeah,
yeah,
it would go down your trachea instead. So therefore, let me ask this, and there are some persons, so you see there's a muscle associated with it, this piece of cartilage, that moves it. So sometimes for whatever reason, let's say, depending if you get a spinal injury, let's say the innervation to this muscle is gone, so you can't move it. For those persons, would they still feed them through the mouth, or would they look to feed them in another way?
So that the one way you had to put the tube up their nose to get the food?
Oh, yeah, sometimes they do that, or what they'll do as well, make an incision directly to the stomach, right? And they actually, pardon?
That is a peg feed.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar. You'll probably know it better than I. A peg feed, I want to say they call it, but possibly. So they put a tube directly to the stomach, and they feed them. What you say, a peg tube? A PEG? Right?
Yeah.
Right, a percutaneous endoscopic gastronomy, and you're quite right. Yeah, it is called a peg tube. Thanks very much. Right, so these feeding tubes, they're called peg tubes, also known as G tubes. And so for persons like that, that's how they'll have to feed them, because if not, anytime they look to eat, it could go down into the lung. And that's a big problem if it goes down into the lung in terms of food infection, as we mentioned before. And then I don't know. Yeah, that'll be problematic, constantly having infection. So for them, they have to put in this peg. Thank you. So the lower respiratory system now, we look at the upper. The lower part consists of the larynx, trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary. So from the area of the larynx down to the bronchioles. So bronchioles, these are they, in terms of the separation of the bronchi. So the bronchi, they separate out into bronchioles, and at the terminal end of the bronchioles, that's where you'll get the alveolus. Your larynx, right, is composed of epiglottis, cartilage, cricoid cartilage, vocal folds, and vestibular. So the vocal folds, these are used for speech, whereas the vocal, they're not, but what they're used is used to increase pressure in the trunk. So the vocal folds, very important, and some of us could sing well. Do we have anybody here who could sing very well, or who is or was part of a choir at some stage in their life? Yes? What you saying?
Sir.
You could sing, what you saying? You could sing Ave Maria.
Yeah, I remember we doing that for our parang we had that time and when I was in primary school.
What
Yeah,
you
we had to
say?
sing that.
Yeah. To me, Ave Maria, once you could sing that, it shows a great range. You had a very good voice control for that one. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And the sopranos had it very hard.
Yeah, oh, I can only imagine, boy. Yeah, you really had to go high on that. Let's continue. Adam's apple, but that's very good. As I say, parang, it brings back fond memories. So yeah, Adam's apple, usually in males, it's more pronounced. And why do you think so? Why do you think with males, the Adam's apple, right, which is the cartilage, which is over the vocal cords, why do you think is more prominent in men than in women? Why do you think so? I don't know if anybody here is mind birds and so on. You might have an answer. Or who listen to, when they think about it, has something to do with reproduction. There's a way you could view it, reproduction in the animal kingdom. Okay, with a peacock and a peahen, which is a male and female peacock, which one has the big plumage, the big sort of tail? And in general, when you look in the animal kingdom, which the males or the females, which one have, you know, the bigger plumage, the more colors, you know, and they do a kind of dance and thing, mating rituals and so on? Is it the male or the female of the species? It's
Female, I
usually the
think.
male, usually the males. Even anybody, if you
Yeah.
have fish, when you look at it, you know, like fighters, it's the males are the one, like the Siamese, those are the ones with a whole lot of colors, right? But the females, yeah, they have colors, but they're more, you know, subtle. When you look at peacock and the peahen in particular, right? Peacock feathers, you know, those bright ones we see, they come from the male. The females don't have, they have, but not as bright a plumage. So when time comes to reproduce, the male, you know, they fluff out the feathers. That's the ones with the big tails that we're accustomed seeing, let's say with peacocks, right? As the male has it, the females don't have, they have feathers, but not as brightly colored and not as many as the male. So in general, and similarly for mating calls, the males are the ones who will be, ooh, you know, when you look in the animal kingdom, those are the ones that make a lot of calls. So one could argue, therefore, that the Adam's apple, when you look at males, it gives you greater vocal range as it relates to certain sounds, right? Particularly deep voices, deep sounds, which you could argue that, you know, some females find attractive in terms of deep voice. When you think about it, in terms of males, you know, if somebody approach you and say, hello, how you going? You know, you're like, ooh. Whereas if somebody come, hey, how you going, young? Go from here, you know. So there is some truth to that in terms of identification of vocal sounds. And the other thing as well, interestingly, high testosterone levels have been associated with deeper voices. So there is that correlation as well in terms of a suitable mate. So again, this is going back from our early genetic times when you're looking at suitability of a mate, right? The deeper voices, you know, indicated, you know, the probability of greater carrying on that genetic information from one species to another and carrying it on with a more viable mate as opposed to one who does not have a high testosterone. Once you have high testosterone, that would indicate then, you know, in terms of the probability of mating successfully, it is enhanced. So therefore, you know, you would seek out, in that regard, you'd seek out ones with the high testosterone. And all of these things could be linked to deep voices. So with the, again, this is a vestige from that era then, you know, in terms of the Adam's apple, males have a more prominent Adam's apple, right? So it moves up and down and could usually be seen, you know, inferior to the, well, that's a laryngopharynx, to the larynx. Well, no, superior to the larynx. Inferior to the oropharyngeal region. All right, so that's the Adam's apple there. Your vocal cords, very important in terms of vibration of the vocal cords. They do bring about sound, and that is something that is unique to the human species. The variations that we have, which brings about sound, as we know, in not only sound, but enables us to communicate. So the trachea composed of 3 layers, an inner, middle, and a thin outer layer, which is comprised of fibrous tissue. After bifurcation, you have the mainstream bronchi, the lobar bronchi, and the segmental bronchi, which supply the bronchopulmonary segments. The bronchioles branch smaller than 1 millimeter, and then these lead to the ducts, and then to the alveoli where the gaseous exchange occurs. So here we are seeing this is the trachea. It bifurcates or splits into 2. Let me ask this, could we live with, why do we have 2 lungs? Why do we have 2 lungs? Anybody wants to hazard a guess? Why 2? Why not 1?
As a spare.
Pardon? Yeah, very good. Thanks very much. As a spare, as a backup, right? For those of the Catholic faith, your current Pope, Pope Francis, he actually has, well, he had a lung infection when he was in his teens, about 18 or 19. And what they did, they removed a significant portion of his lung. I don't know if it's right or his left lung, but they removed a significant, back then, right? He's now well into his 80s, but back then, antibiotics were not well known and accepted. Right? So when he did have infection, what they'd have to do is remove the diseased tissue as opposed to giving the person antibiotics. So he's missing a significant portion of his lungs. So to answer that question, you could live with 1 lung, actually, because with him, for all intents and purposes, one of his lungs, more than 2/3 is gone. So since his teenage years to now, he's survived on 1 lung, and he's well into his 80s now. So he's over 60 years, over 3. Over 60, yeah, over 6 decades, you know, he has survived on 1 lung. And the reason we do have 2, quite rightly said, is a backup. Could you think of any other organs in the body that you have 2 of them?
Kidney.
Pardon? Kidneys, yes. What about in your reproductive system?
Fallopian tube.
Fallopian tubes, and the fallopian tubes go to the, leading into the fallopian tubes, you have 2 structures in the females, begins with O.
Ovaries.
Right, you have 2 ovaries, right? And you could argue, yeah. And then in the males, you have 2, begins with T, not ovaries, but
Testicles.
right, testicles or testes, right? So you have 2 testes in the male, and you have 2 ovaries in the females. And again, those are backup system. You have 2 kidneys as well as backup system. You have 2 lungs as backup system. The liver itself is a large structure. And the thing with the liver, all the cells do the same thing in the liver itself. So you have a repetition of functionality in the liver, and that is important as well as backup. The liver could actually function you could lose up to 60% of your liver, oftentimes through cirrhosis of the liver. So for persons who do have the disease alcoholism, right, cirrhosis of the liver, and I say they lose up to 60%, you could still survive. So when you hear somebody has their liver, you know, let's say if they do have the disease alcoholism, and they've lost functionality of the liver, that means it's more than 60% gone. You know, when they hear they have liver failure and they need to have a replacement, you know, transplant, yeah, it's more than 60% gone. Okay. What muscle is this here? This one here, I forgot. What is it? It's dome shape. And we looked at it over there. Which one is it? This is the main muscle associated with respiration. And which one is it? It begins with D.
Diaphragm.
Excellent. Well done, Avril. This is your diaphragm. Right? And what happens when you breathe in? The diaphragm goes down. So it's a guts pusher down a muscle. It goes down. And how do we breathe air in since we're looking at it, how do we breathe air in? In lecture, did you all look at which one is it? What's the law that governs the movement of air into the lung? that has to deal with pressure and volume.
So we haven't done this as yet in the lecture, you know.
You all haven't done respiration yet in the lecture?
No, we just got it today.
Oh, respiration. Well, you all know, okay, you all now got respiration. Oh, you're now doing it in terms of respiration, okay? So, well, I could just speak to it ever so gently, but the law that governs it is Boyle's law. I don't know if that was mentioned in the lecture, Boyle's law. Yeah, nope, not yet.
No, sir.
Okay, so Boyle's law, and what Boyle's law states is that PV, pressure times volume, is a constant, right? So PV is equal to K. Now, very simply, how do we breathe in? Everybody, you're familiar with a seesaw? I always have to ask this question because I know we're in the electronic age and some people would not have a clue. Everybody familiar with a seesaw? Yes?
Yes, sir.
All right, if you're not familiar with a seesaw, raise your hand. Somebody raise their hand there? Oh, no, everybody. Okay, everybody familiar with a seesaw. So think of a seesaw, right? And on one side of it, and what happens with a seesaw? One side goes up, one side comes down, yes? So with a seesaw, in terms of Boyle's law says that pressure and volume, they're interrelated. Now, what is that relationship? Well, think of a seesaw. On one side, you have volume, and the other side has pressure. When volume goes down, what happens to pressure? If both of them on different sides of a seesaw, when volume goes down, what happens to the pressure?
It rises.
Right, so pressure goes up. And when volume goes up, what happens to pressure?
It decreases.
It decreases or it goes down. And that's all you need to know to appreciate the explanation of how we breathe in. Let's see how we could tie that in. So when you breathe in, whenever you give the explanation, always give it from the standpoint of volume. That's one thing to have in your mind. So you're explaining how you're breathing in, but you're talking about volumes. Let's go. So when you inhale, what happens? Well, the diaphragm, your guts push down a muscle, goes down, it pushes down. So this muscle contracts, the diaphragm contracts, it flattens out, creates more space. The intercostals as well move the ribs up and out, so it creates space for the lungs to expand. Let's talk about the volume of the lungs now. The volume of the lungs increase, right? They have more space. And when the volume of the lungs increases, what happens to the pressure? Think about the seesaw. When volume increases, what happens to pressure?
It decreases.
It decreases. So therefore, the pressure in your lungs is actually lower than the pressure in the external environment. We good so far?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
The pressure in the lungs decreases. So outside here it's high, inside here is low. If I were to tell you that, the same rule that applies to diffusion also applies to gases, how would the air move then? Would it move from outside to in or inside to out? In here, remember, we just said, the lungs
So
expand.
outside to in?
Correct is right. You're very good. So we just mentioned, okay, when you breathe in, diaphragm goes down, intercostal pulls the ribs up and out, and the volume increases within the lungs, right? The volume increases. Because the volume goes up, the pressure decreases because of Boyle's law. So the pressure in your lungs is lower than the external pressure. So how does gas move? Area of high pressure to low. So literally the gas is sucked into your lungs when you breathe in. So because of the fact that the lungs are expanding, the air is sucked in. And that's how air moves in. And when you breathe out, what happens? The diaphragm goes back into the dome position. The intercostals, right, they no longer expand, they contract, and they bring back the rib cage into its smaller position. And what happens to your lungs? The volume of the lungs decrease. Think about the seesaw. If the volume decreases, what happens to the pressure in your lungs?
It increases.
The pressure increases, and it increases to the point where it is greater than atmospheric pressure. So how does air move? from the area of high pressure to area of low pressure and is literally forced out of your lungs. And that's how you breathe out, right? So the air movement is closely tied to Boyle's law, but also tied to the movement of the ribs and the diaphragm in terms of expansion of the volume of the lungs. All right? Don't worry, it takes a little while to marinate it. I'll write out, let me see if I could write out something and paste it in on the page itself, how you explain it. But always remember, you explain it from the position of volume of the lungs. Okay? And this is just showing the lungs again in terms of the cartilage around the lungs. This will be a trachea, so it bifurcates into your bronchi. This is smaller, the bronchioles. These little bunch of grapes or the bunch of pure, this is your alveoli, and they're crisscrossed with these little vessels. What are these vessels which allow the exchange of gases, these blood vessels? What are they? It begins with C.
Capillaries.
Capillaries, yeah. So the capillaries, they crisscross them. It crisscrosses the alveoli. And this is just showing the alveoli. Type 1 and type 2. Which one produces surfactant, type 1 or type 2? In terms of the pneumocytes.
So type 1?
That was a good guess, but it was a
But type
50-50. Type 2, there
Yeah,
you go. There you
I
go.
was saying type 2 at first, but then I said,
Yeah. The type 2, they facilitate the exchange, right? The type 2, but the ones that secrete the surfactant, the type 1, sorry, facilitate the gaseous exchange. The type 2, that's the one that secrete the surfactant. Yeah. I think I know what you were thinking. You're probably thinking along the lines, well, the surfactant, they facilitate the absorption. It was a badly worded question. I retract the question. It was badly worded. I could say it could have caused some confusion. But the ones that deliberately secrete surfactant will be the type 2, the type 1s. Those are the ones which these are the flattened ones, and they allow for the exchange of the gas itself. So the bronchioles. Right, the bronchioles, they control the resistance and they open into the alveoli. When we are looking at it, remember it's the trachea split into the bronchi, then they split up even further into bronchioles. And these bronchioles then open into the alveoli, which are the little bunches of grapes. The right lung and the left lung, which one is bigger? If I were to ask you that, which one is bigger, the right lung or the left lung? Which one would you say?
right.
The right lung is
Right.
bigger, so therefore the left lung is smaller. The left lung is smaller because it has to accommodate a certain organ in the body. What organ is that? Or what structure?
The heart.
The heart.
The
Very
heart.
good. Yeah, very good. Very good. It has to accommodate the heart, so therefore it's smaller because of that reason. Let's have a look and see. So here it is the lobes, and here is this indentation. This is your lingula. Right, this area here, but this is where you have your heart. Notice it's called the cardiac notch, but your heart fits there, and because of that region, it's missing. So that's one way you could actually tell a lung which one is the left and which one is the right, because of the fact it's missing that little piece. In terms of the pieces of the heart, you have the superior, middle, and inferior. And notice with the right lung, you have just a superior and an inferior. Right, but you also have this little part here known as the lingula. It's not shown here, but this is the small part of the lung. It's shown more clearly here. This protrusion is known as the lingula, and again with the right and left lung, you have the upper and the oblique fissure. The oblique and the horizontal fissures. The horizontal fissure is missing here, and because of that, you don't have this third portion of the lung itself, whereas in the right lung you do have it. You have these 3 lobes, but in the left lung you have 2 lobes. All right, so here we are looking at an X-ray. Over here, on this side, this is the left side or your right side on this side over here? This is your left or your right side?
Left.
Left, okay. Anybody think it's the right side?
No.
No, very good. Okay, it is the left. How do you know? What anatomical structure lets you know this is the left side. What is this thing here? What structure is this?
The heart.
The heart. And the apex of the heart always points in what direction? It points to the left. So there's the left side, right? So therefore, that's how you know. Whenever you see the heart, you know, and you see, if you notice, the majority of this cloudy area is on the left side. That's basically all you need to know. Once you see the majority of the cloudy region, you know immediately this is the left side. And the apex, or the pointy part of the heart, it always points to the left. That's how you know that is the left side. Very good. The coverings. Does the lungs have coverings? Yes. Which other organ that we have already looked at has coverings as well? You know, and the reason why is to prevent friction. Which other organ? Well, there's only one other organ we looked at thus far.
The heart.
The heart. Very good. Applause. So, yeah, the heart has these membranes that prevent friction, and conversely, the heart has a covering that prevents friction with the lungs, and the lungs as well. It has coverings to prevent friction against when you look at the with the heart itself. The pleural space, so that's the space around it, contains fluid, and it avoids air from entering the pleural space. And if it does happen, a pneumothorax or a collapse of the lung may occur. So this is just showing if you do have, let's say, a puncture wound, you have a space, the pleural space, from the time the air, because it's kept in place there, because as I mentioned, this is a sealed, your lungs are actually sealed in. So if it does puncture, your lungs will actually shrivel. So what they have to do in terms of a collapsed lung, is it serious? Yes. Sometimes, depending on the size, it could heal on its own. So therefore, if it's a small puncture wound, it could heal on its own. But if you find, of course, that you're having labored breathing or trouble breathing, well, most definitely. Or if you have a knife stuck into your chest, well, most definitely you'll want to go and seek, medical assistance. Now, the treatment usually involves inserting a needle between the ribs to remove the excess air. So they insert the needle, they remove the air or decrease the pressure, and the lungs then will expand to their normal size. The usual, with some persons, depending on the size of the incision, right, that is put there, usually they would stitch it up. So within 2 to 3 weeks, the pain does go away. Right, and you have, okay, your lungs, your breathing, of course, once they remove the air, from this region, it does expand out, and then they stitch it up, right? So you will be able to breathe normally, but you just get a pain from where the wound site occurred, and usually wound site that will heal within 2 to 3 weeks, where that is concerned. All right, so we mentioned this already in terms of the lungs. Right, the lungs, you have the alveoli. This is the terminal end of the bronchi, and around the bronchi, around these alveoli, they're crisscrossed with the capillaries. How does this gaseous exchange occur? We mentioned simple diffusion from the area of high to low in terms of oxygen from the alveolus into the blood. In terms of CO2, high concentration of CO2 in the blood, it diffuses across the capillary membrane into from the blood into the capillary, across the capillary membrane and into the alveolus to be breathed out. So this is just showing then the blood flow. Right, the capillaries, they then become either venules or arterioles, which then become arteries and veins respectively. So we have the pulmonary artery. Does the pulmonary artery carry deoxygenated or oxygenated blood? Which one? The pulmonary artery?
Deoxygenated.
Deoxygenated blood is the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood. So why didn't they call it? Now, usually arteries carry oxygenated blood. So why they just didn't call it pulmonary vein then? Right? Normally arteries, oxygenated vein, deoxygenated blood. So since this is carrying deoxygenated blood, why did they not call it just the pulmonary vein? Well, one definition of arteries and veins relates to the fact that they carry oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Another definition states that vessels leaving the heart are called arteries, and the ones that return blood to the heart are vein. What is the major blood vessel that returns blood to the heart? VC.
Vena cava.
Excellent. The superior and inferior vena cava. Very good, or vena cava, right? So in terms of naming the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein, they use the definition that vessels leaving the heart, those vessels that leaving the heart are arteries. So right? So, and on that topic, what's the major artery that leaves the heart again? Begins with A and ends in E.
Aorta.
Excellent. Aorta. Well done. So the aorta, that's a major artery, but by definition then, vessels leaving the heart, they're called arteries. Vessels returning blood to the heart are known as veins. So that's why when in terms of the pulmonary circuit, blood leaving the heart from the right ventricle going to the lungs via they leave, since they're leaving the heart, they define it as the pulmonary artery. So as a definition then, oxygenated blood does travel through arteries with the exception of the pulmonary artery, and conversely, deoxygenated blood or blood low in oxygen is usually travels in veins with the exception of the pulmonary vein. The pulmonary vein, in this case, it does have oxygenated blood and is now returning to the heart itself via the left atria, and then we'll go from the left atria to the left ventricle, then out the aorta to get into the systemic circulation. So what we're looking at here, this part of the pulmonary circulation, whereas the systemic, that is the blood going through the entire body. Pulmonary refers to blood leaving the heart, going to the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then it returns to the heart again, goes through the left atria, left ventricle, then it goes into the systemic circulation now to distribute oxygen throughout the body itself. All right, we're almost there. Hang on, we have 10 slides again. Are you still there with me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Are you there? All right, let's go. So this is just showing
Yes, sir.
gas exchange. Excellent. So the deoxygenated is shown here, deoxygenated blood from the pulmonary artery, right? It picks up oxygen and then becomes, now it's oxygenated. And that now goes back to the heart and then enters the systemic circulation, right? Air, of course, you're breathing this in. This is coming in from into your lungs. And this is how you have this exchange occurring. All right, respiratory cycle. Well, I spoke to this already in terms of when we breathe in and breathe out, right? And how the pressure causes the movement of air. Long volumes. With these volumes, inspiratory, you'll be very well placed to actually learn them, right? And also to recognize them on this graph. So please learn the definitions. When you're looking at lab exams, there's always mandate. You could bet they're going to come in terms of these questions on this. Tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, maximum volume that can be inspired over the inspiration of a normal breath. The expiratory reserve volume, as shown here, the residual. Now note that there's always, you never really breathe out all the air from your lungs. There's always a little bit that is left, and that is known as a reduced residual volume. And the functional residual capacity is the volume of gas remaining in the lungs after normal expiration. Inspiratory, vital, and total lung capacity are shown here, and they're represented on this. So take note of this. So let's say even for the spotter or for your assessment in the lab, let's say you get this, and it might just be asked to label it. So you wouldn't have, let's say, these names here. And you just have, let's say, letters A, B, and C. You have a drop-down menu. What is A? What is B? What is C? It could come. That's as straightforward as that. Okay? So what we looked at today, we looked at the lung. That's one last thing I want to close on is the last slide here, hyperventilation. Right? And coming back to the case of persons who have asthmatic or who are hyperventilating, when you hyperventilate, oftentimes they say that, okay, breathing into a paper bag will actually help when you need to increase the amount of oxygen. Anybody knows how that works? Why would breathing into a paper bag? Well, you'll speak more to it in your lecture, but all that to say is this. When you're looking at blood, let's say the carrying capacity of a red blood cell, for argument's sake, is 5 units of oxygen. When you're looking at the red blood cell, you're looking at a hemoglobin being present in the center. It's a protein which has a high affinity for oxygen, hemoglobin. So let's say it picks up 5 units of oxygen. When it does reach the cells, it would give off, let's say about 3, but it always keeps either 1 or 2. It keeps a bit of oxygen always bonded to it. So even when the red blood cells give off the oxygen, they always keep some in reserve. The only way you could get that reserve off is if you increase your carbon dioxide content in your blood. And it once your blood, there are chemoreceptors which send messages, right, to, well, it's an inherent property of the red blood cells, but your body detects it. In chemoreceptors, it goes to the respiratory center, you detect this change. But all that being said, one of the properties of these red blood cells, when they do encounter high concentrations of carbon dioxide in the blood, what they would do is actually release it. So one of the things you do when you hyperventilate and you breathe into a bag, normally the air that you breathe out has significantly higher concentrations of CO2 than the air we breathe in. By now breathing back in that high concentration of CO2, you're tapping into that ability of the red blood cells to release oxygen when the concentration of CO2 is higher, is relatively high. And that is why you breathe into a bag. You're increasing the carbon dioxide content, and it might sound weird, but by increasing the carbon dioxide concentration in your blood, you cause the red blood cells to release their reserve oxygen. And in so doing, right, now you have this release of oxygen and the hyperventilation. When you're hyperventilating, you need oxygen. So the release of the oxygen that is kept in reserve by the red blood cells, and that will actually stop the hyperventilation. So it's a technique that is used. Why do they use a brown bag and not a plastic bag? Anybody? For a very simple reason. It's very important to use a brown bag and not a plastic bag. Why not a plastic bag? What's one of the dangers of using a plastic bag when you're hyperventilating? What is one of the dangers that could occur? Go ahead, Abison. You wanted to say something? Mm-hmm.
So the plastic bag, you could accidentally inhale the plastic bag and it could suffocate you.
Correct is right. That's a whole nother, and that's a whole nother set of trouble. Imagine you suck down, because you know when you're hyperventilating, you know, it's a very big suction, and you suck down that plastic bag, oh Lord, into your lungs. That's a whole nother set of issues. So that's why you use a non-collapsible brown bag. They hold their shape even when you suck it in. It's when you're breathing in very rapidly. Okay. All right.